Star Wars Outlaws is becoming an entirely different game. I will get to all the different facets of this story because the game was obviously quite divisive when it released back in August. We had sales that were softer than expected, according to Insider Gaming, leading to Ubisoft declaring that they will be making sweeping changes to the game alongside delaying Assassin's Creed Shadows as well into 2025 to make sure that both games could take on as much fan feedback as possible. Now, while we're still waiting to see what Assassin's Creed Shadows is like, that's now coming February 14th, 2025, Star Wars Outlaws has been given a new creative director post-launch. The Division 1 and 2's Drew Reckner, who has come in and made various sweeping changes to every facet of the game. And by the time people hear this, those patches will be, or some of these patches will be in the game. There are more coming up. But multiple huge patches have been detailed, with things like forced stealth in the game being removed and a greater viability for going all guns blazing in any mission now being encouraged. Ubisoft note that stealth will always be an option, but you can choose your way through the game, how you want to play the game, as much as you want going forward if you prefer. If you want to shoot everything up, you can now. Alongside are tons of changes, and people who have played Outlaws will know how much these affect things. We both finished the game. We've talked about it quite a lot on the podcast. But Ubisoft are adding aiming down sights, different cover mechanics, adding weak points to enemies, letting you keep heavy weapons rather than ditch them when climbing, engaging in combat inside syndicate areas that previously were more restricted beforehand. Enemy AI is also receiving a massive upgrade. Enemy types are being made more distinct and assumedly being invented as well, because for the most part you're going up against one type for most of that game. There are lots of new defeat animations when you shoot people. There are new cover animations when you take cover. Kay's pistol is differently affected on cover. If you shoot one side of it, it'll affect an enemy on the other side. Certain weapons have been completely rebuilt from the ground up with different shooting patterns, and Ubisoft / Drew Reckner says there are still more changes to come because they want to keep listening to fan feedback, and the goal is to let you play the way that you want to play, and they are very open to feedback on social media in general. Thoughts on this before I predict the end of the world?
Dude, I mean, the common theme is every time we buy a new game, we feel like we're in early access. Why am I beta testing this fully priced release for a company like Ubisoft for them to change fundamental things so many months later? When they announced that they were getting a new creative director for Outlaws after it had launched, I didn't really know what to make of it. Because, I mean, like you said, me and you liked it. I didn't think the problems were that fundamental or even worth changing that much. Like, yes, this will probably make for an overall better experience, but is it going to get people to the game so many months after it already launched? Like, yes, it is going to be transformative to not be forced into stealth. Yes, the new death animations and the new handling of weapons is cool, but, like, I don't know, it's going to make the game marginally better, but it's going to piss off probably the people who played it at launch and kind of wish they had those features. And I don't think, for me personally, it's going to do enough to get people in who didn't play it, because to me, and I don't know if you agree, but the issues with Outlaws and what's stopping it from becoming a great game are more fundamental, are more systemic. It's not just the way that shooting feels. It's often like the mission design, or it's the faction system not being fleshed out enough. It's the repetition in the main missions, or how some of those latter planets and later planets just feel a little bit rushed and unfinished. Like, there are core problems, and I just wonder, like, could you not be fixing the problems that you're fixing now and expanding on the stealth and expanding on, like, the gunplay? Could you not be doing that, like, for a DLC or for a sequel? Like, is that not more beneficial than trying to salvage this already pretty good game?
Well, yeah, surely the whole point of this was to sort of like soft relaunch the game, which I thought they were going to do at the beginning of next year. Maybe they didn't want it to clash with Assassin's Creed too much, and maybe since getting the new creative director and they've been able to turn more things around faster than they thought. A lot of this, like I said, Drew Reckner did work on Division 1 and 2. He was a AI designer and then a general game designer for the sequel. A lot of this just sounds like you're making it into the Division, which obviously overall there was a lot of the Division's DNA in Star Wars Outlaws anyway. But it is interesting just sort of going, okay, we're going to have aim down sights, we're going to have swapping shoulders when you're taking aim, weak points on enemies, and just sort of having an all-round more combat-focused third-person shooter. And maybe that's the way. But the average person is not going to know that these changes even happened. Like, it's not like you said, they're not tying it to a DLC like Cyberpunk did with Phantom Liberty. They're just patching the game. And if you happen to already have it, then next time you boot it up, it'll play better. But there's not like a big big, wider marketing push. I don't even really know how you put one together, because you need to acknowledge that the version of the game that you sold was completely different. And this is now, like I said, a third-person shooter and not a Splinter Cell adjacent stealth game. To me, I massively agree with you. The first thing I was going to say in terms of if I was going to upend the parts of Outlaws that don't work, it's half of the planets. Toshara and Tatooine are awesome, but the back two planets that you go to kind of suck. They're way undercooked and they feel pretty unfinished. And the game's story gives up on itself by the end as well. So those are the big issues to me. I had an absolute blast with almost scientifically half of this video game, and I loved a lot of it. But it's the more you play it, especially towards the end, is when it starts to fall off. And being able to shoot your way through already threadbare content is not going to save it.
That's what frustrates me a lot, because I even used Outlaws as sort of a case study recently. I did a video on stealth, and one of the reasons why I think stealth in AAA kind of genre blend action games doesn't really work is because the open world systems in many cases and the loot and the crafting kind of doesn't gel with being able to fully sneak through areas and not engage with, picking up and looting enemies and finding collectibles and, gathering those resources that help you progress, like upgrade trees and stuff. So to see that they're actually, in my opinion, diluting that system even more by just making it entirely optional, by increasing your validity in gunplay. To me, Outlaws was so enjoyable because it felt like slightly more of a stealth game than the stealth games that we're used to, even from Ubisoft. And it's like, why not double down on those elements? Yeah, maybe take away the restrictions of having to get kicked back to a checkpoint if you're seen, but add in more unique stealth mechanics. Change the level design to accommodate it a bit more, to make it even more diluted and to make it more of an option and focus more on the kind of shooting that we've experienced from Ubisoft games in the past, like you said, especially The Division. That to me just makes it more bland. It might make it a better shooter, but is that gonna, I don't know, is that gonna win anyone round? I don't know.
I think the wider thing as well that I wanted to touch on is just that idea of like giving the game a new creative director after its launch, like really doubling down on not just sort of early access, but full launch products can still be overhauled. And then, like, what does that mean for the version of the game that you bought into? And it's not like it's brand new. Obviously, there are games, video games overall as a medium are quite modular anyway. But I feel like this is a step in and it's sort of like, I would say, the wrong direction in terms of like how much this affects the potential vision of the game going in. There are things like No Man's Sky that is like iterated for 8 years. Some of that was getting the game up to a certain level that was in line with the marketing, and then Hello Games then went so far beyond that, factoring in fan feedback, but also having tons of their own ideas in there. I think it's a weird precedent to set that a company as big as Ubisoft ostensibly just admit they don't know what the game should be, and then you just look at the fan feedback. Okay, shall we make that? Right, I think that's going to work. Let's do this. Like, to me, I joked about the end of the world thing before, but it's like that's the death of artistry. No artist, no creator says, "What do you want me to make?" Right, I'll do that. Like, it's just not the way that it should work.
I fully agree. I think Outlaws is the way it is for a reason. You have to assume that someone believed in the mechanics the way that they were. You have to assume that they believed gunplay should have worked like that to, enhance a certain scoundrel vibe. Like, it was one of the things that we praised when we talked about it. We quite liked that. Shooting was scrappy, it was run and gun, you were picking things up, you were using them, you were throwing them away. You weren't like a military person in the game, like you weren't even a Commander Shepard or anything, like that wasn't your role. Your role was to be more of an Indiana Jones or a Han Solo than it was to be Marcus Phoenix or something. So to kind of dilute that, I think, is a mistake. And yeah, like you said, what precedent does this send? On the one hand, I do like that they're listening to fans. On the other hand, I'd prefer them to kind of stick to their guns. And on the third hand, that I've just sprouted from me, from my chest, like Videodrome dome, I wonder about what precedent this sends going forward in terms of the messaging for Ubisoft games, because this doesn't make me want to buy an Ubisoft game ever again at launch, when even the single-player titles that they're producing are getting such transformations across the first few months of their release. Like, we know that they've already pushed Shadows to change some things, to add some things, to tweak it. Who's to say that game launches early next year and they don't continue changing things as it goes on? Like, why would I buy something day one from this company and assume that I'm getting the best version anymore when so much is getting overhauled all the time.
Totally. They're in such a weird... Like this path is a bad place to be in if you're a major part of the industry and you're a major producer of various IPs that people love. Star Wars Outlaws, obviously, couched in being a Star Wars product, but it's still a new story, new characters, new ways to play, whatever it is. Assassin's Creed, like if you extend this mentality over to Assassin's Creed, then they've already pushed it back. Because a lot of the pre-orders seem quite soft. There was some historical inaccuracies they wanted to get to, not Yasuke, but wider stuff in terms of the environments, the architecture, things that they literally just got wrong that do need to be fixed. Fair enough. But overall, it's like, if that game comes out with something like this, have you just emboldened like the sort of the haters, the people who want a different game? It's like there are valid talking points in there sometimes, but it depends how they're presented. It depends how much credence you then give that stuff. It depends why you're in the industry. Yeah. Like, surely you're in the industry to make a video game with a certain vision, a certain set of mechanics, and a team focus that is bringing that thing together. Or it can be a solo dev or whatever. But to launch it and then look at the feedback and go, there's 1,000 people have signed this petition. We're going to have to put that in. Like, that's such a weird... And I'm not necessarily saying it's a unilateral negative, but I am for artistry. But I think it's weird. That's a weird way to do business. And I can't see them being, if there was ever an Ubisoft of old, a decently, healthily performing Ubisoft with this mentality at their core.
Absolutely. And I think you're right in that, of course, there will be a lot of people probably online wanting these changes, but I think it's almost impossible now to differentiate between like a really vocal minority of players who constantly demand things and just people who are all right with it, who don't comment, who don't put pressure on the studios to change stuff. I think you've seen that in the multiplayer space so much. I always talk about Call of Duty, right? Catering with Modern Warfare 3 towards the most online and the most vocal players about tiny little features that, are important, but become so blown out of proportion that you end up with Modern Warfare 3, like a brand new sequel, selling itself on changes to slide cancelling and getting incredibly granular with the tiny technical tweaks that they're making rather than thinking about the bigger picture. And I just don't think, like you said, even if you please some people with that, there's going to be people who either didn't want it or didn't care and are wondering why you spent so much time on it. And I think it is kind of a rabbit hole to get down. I'm not saying don't ever take feedback on board, but I think that's why you kind of do play tests. That's why you kind of do things before release. And to a certain extent, I think, stick by your guns, even if those guns, even if no one likes those guns, even if it doesn't sell, like, that is the decision you've made. That is the artistry that you wanted to put out into the world, and don't kind of compromise on it, even if people don't love it. I don't know. Yeah. It's like the Mass Effect 3 situation. Sorry to cut you off. No. It's like the Mass Effect 3 situation where, like, I appreciate BioWare doing an extended cut for the ending of that game, but I almost think you shouldn't have had to. You know what I mean?
No,
I was one of those people back in the day, because I was a bit younger, kind of demanding more from them, demanding them to change things, demanding them to take our feedback on board. And I kind of look back at myself and think, like, who are you to demand that? You know what I mean? This is what they wanted to do. I don't have to like it, but it's what they wanted to do. They don't have to change it for my whims.
True. I think the fascinating part, though, in Mass Effect 3's case and Star Wars Outlaws' case, is that they both had tumultuous developments. Like, I did talk to various members of Ubisoft when I put together a video the other month on the state of Ubisoft, what's happening behind the scenes kind of thing. Obviously, those people remain anonymous, but part of those conversations were about Outlaws, about how things like being able to pick up a heavy weapon and carry it as you climbed up it, like pick up a sniper rifle and climb it as you went up the side of a cliff and use that from above. That was meant to be in the game, and it was ditched. But it's hilarious because I liked that you had to ditch heavy weapons. It forced you to think tactically of, like, I'm going to use this machine gun for these 3 guards and I'm going to throw it away and I'm going to do this other thing. So, like, it's a weird thing. Mass Effect 3, like, the development of that game, they threw out the original ending. They scrapped the whole thing, went again. So if you work on those projects, maybe there are conversations to be like, we should put something else out. We should address something. And it's like this weird gray area. But with to bring it back to Outlaws, it just feels like all these changes so fundamentally change the game genre. You're going from a stealth game to a third-person shooter. And I guess we'll see, the patches are out across the next few days, how people take to it. I'll be amazed if it turns the player numbers around, because I feel like in general a lot of people just didn't want to play as K-Vess, or didn't like the sort of jokey Marvel Disney tone, or something in a wider sense. They maybe wanted more characters they would associate with Star Wars or whatever it is. I'm curious if it affects that stuff, but But in terms of the tumultuous developments leading to post-launch fixes, this is, as far as I can tell, unprecedented. We've never had a new creative director post-launch.
It's especially for a game that wasn't a disaster. Like, something like Cyberpunk 2077, that needed extra work, that needed overhauling, that needed tweaking, that was clearly unfinished. In all games, to a certain extent, like you said, are slightly unfinished. There are features that didn't make deadline date and had to be cut and couldn't be realized. But when you get a game like Outlaws, which isn't even doing bad, like it's getting, maybe lukewarm reviews, 7 out of 10s, maybe some low 8s, but it's not a complete trash fire to then commit this hard and bring in a new creative director for it post-launch for a game that isn't a live service, for a game that isn't multiplayer focused. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see if this becomes the norm kind of going forward, because, to me, I'm not fully, I know this might sound rich, I'm not fully against it in theory in terms of making changes, but don't expect me then to buy in day one ever again.
Yeah, totally. If there was a bar you were trying to hit and the release day cut that off and you're sitting there going, we need to put this in, fine. But I think that at some point when does development even end? Does development ever end at this point?
Just, if you're going to do it, if this is your plan, just, in my opinion, be real and slap on an early access what would you even call it? Sticker to the title, tell me, even charge the same amount that you would. Charge 70 quid, make it on Ubisoft Plus, and I'll be fine with it. But you've got to tell me this is what it is. And if you don't tell me it, and I buy into it thinking it's the finished article, that's when we have problems. That's when you lose the trust. But if this was, I would not be having this conversation with the same sort of passion that I am now with you if I played Star Wars Outlaws Early Access in August. But I didn't. I played Star Wars Outlaws, and now that's changing.